Um,
No,
I
sorry.
work regularly as ecologist for the Lower Ewer Conservation Trust, and I do various other things as well. So tonight's just quite a quick webinar. I'm going to try and sort of like limit it, my bit, to about 20 minutes. Talking about magnesian limestone grassland, which is one of North Yorkshire's special habitats, but one we actually don't know very much about. So we're trying to find out a bit more about how much of it we've got and where. So really it's just an introduction to the habitat and a bit of a run through of what we know and what we don't. So the magnesian limestone is a geological formation, and it stretches in a very discrete, narrow band that basically starts in the northern outskirts of Nottingham and extends up through South Yorkshire, North Yorkshire, across the River Tees, and up to Sunderland. I mean, I think it just extends onto the north bank of the Wear there at Sunderland. And usually this limestone ridge is divided into two parts, the northern one north of the Tees, so in historic County Durham, and the southern magnesian limestone south of the Tees. So it consists of limestone and other deposits that were laid down in a shallow tropical sea during what geologists know as the Permian era. So that was about 295 to 250 million years ago. And it's often described as an environment similar to what you'd experience in the Bahamas today, if you can imagine that. So although we refer to it as the magnesian limestone, there are various other rocks. There are mudstones, gritstones, sandstones, other types of sedimentary rocks that you'd expect in a marine and shallow water environment, and also what we call evaporites, which are the minerals left when the water evaporates away. And the best known of those is gypsum. You know, so obviously you're probably all aware of the issues with gypsum subsidence that we see around Ripon. So the grassland that you get on magnesian limestone is similar in many respects to other types of lowland limestone grassland. So if we think in Yorkshire, we've got the chalk grasslands that are found in steep valleys and the Yorkshire Wolds, and we've got bits of limestone grassland on the Jurassic limestone. So you might have been to sites around the kind of like the southern margins of the North York Moors on the lowland Jurassic limestone there. And then to the west, as we get into parts of the Dales, you've got the Carboniferous upland limestones. So the type of natural or semi-natural grassland we get on the magnesian limestone is not that dissimilar to other types of lowland limestone grassland, but it does have its own special features. And although we call it the limestone grassland, it does extend onto gravel soils. So for instance, at Thornborough Henges, we've got essentially the same flora there, and that's because the gravel there is made up of a large proportion of limestone fragments. And I think that's probably the case at High Batts as well, isn't it? So this grassland, it varies in appearance. So the photograph here is Spring Hill at Ripon Parks. So it can be a very short, closely grazed grassland, often with these are very old ant hills that you see on it, or it can be a much sort of like taller, coarser, tussocky sward with bigger grasses like upright brome or tall grass, and that's what you might see on road verges. There is one specific type of grassland that only occurs on the magnesian limestone. That's called blue moor grass, small scabious grassland, but that only occurs in a few sites in the County Durham area of the northern magnesian limestone to the north of the River Tees. It doesn't occur in Yorkshire. So this type of grassland is made up of what we call calcicole plants. You're probably all familiar with the idea that different plants like different types of soil. So for instance, if you want to grow azaleas, rhododendrons, heathers and so on, you want a very acidic soil for that. So on the limestone we have lime dwelling plants, and the technical name is they're calcicoles. So it's a calcicolous flora the terms are a bit confusing and they're used quite loosely. We tend to refer to the actual geology and soils as calcareous, so made up of calcium, but don't worry about that at all. So these are plants which prefer growing on lime-rich soils, and they're adapted to the conditions on those soils, which are actually quite stressful. So when you've got soils with a very high calcium content and high pH, it's actually quite difficult for plants to get hold of things like iron and zinc and manganese, and also a phosphate, which is a crucial growing for plant growth, is quite difficult for plants to absorb on these soils. So these are plants that have evolved ways of coping with these conditions, so that they actually grow particularly well, and they favour lime-rich soils. So, for instance, quite a lot of them have developed mechanisms where they can absorb iron very well, or they're very efficient at taking up the small amounts of phosphate that are available in the soil. I'm going to be careful here because I know there's two plant physiologists here, so I'm not going to get into anything too technical, otherwise they'll start heckling me. So one thing these plants sometimes do is that the roots actually secrete acids into the soil to bring some of these nutrients and trace elements to make them more available, to bring them into solution. And although calcium itself is essential for all plants, large amounts of it can be toxic. So these plants that specialise in growing on limestone soils have evolved ways of dealing with that. So they're either good at taking all that calcium up and storing it in a harmless way in their tissues, or they have mechanisms which allow them to reduce the amount of calcium they actually take up, and that sometimes involves fungi which colonise the plant roots. So lots of different mechanisms that these plants have for coping with quite a difficult environment. So the flip side of that is there are great benefits for plants growing on a calcium-rich soil, and one of those is you avoid metal poisoning, particularly aluminium, which is a very toxic element. So on very acid soils of a low pH, aluminium is a real problem for many plants, and also invertebrates and microorganisms and so on. So if you live on a lime-rich soil, you have no risk of that. So that's another aspect of why certain plants prefer growing on calcium-rich soils. So if you were to take these plants, like say the greater knapweed that is on the picture here, and you were to plant those on an acidic, sandy soil, they would start to get symptoms of aluminium poisoning. The converse side to that, of course, is if you've ever tried to take a sort of like rhododendron and plant it in a soil that has a high calcium content, the leaves will go yellow and it will get very sickly quite quickly. So it's just, the point is these are plants that have particular adaptations to growing in calcium-rich soils. So what makes magnesian limestone grassland special? Well, if you imagine that map I showed you earlier, the magnesian limestone is almost like it's been referred to as an ecological bridge. So to the south of this, there's no chalk further north. So we've got the lowland limestones of southern and eastern England, and then you've got the mainly carboniferous limestones of the upland areas to the north and west, and the magnesian limestone kind of like forms a bridge between the two. It also, purely coincidentally, runs along the what we call biogeographical axis. So if you take a line roughly from the Tees estuary to the Severn estuary, if you imagine that, you've got the warmer and drier lowlands to the south and east of that, and you've got the wetter and cooler uplands to the north and west of that. And the magnesian limestone happens to more or less follow that dividing line. So because of its position, we get some species of plants and invertebrates that are at the southern edge of their range here, but also species that are at the northern edge of their distribution. So it's interesting from that point of view. So overall, the southern magnesian limestone, so south of the River Tees, is mainly characterised by widespread or southern species. So we've got a whole range of plants that I've listed here. I won't go through them all individually, but they're at or they're very close to the northern edge of their range on the magnesian limestone. So, for instance, passiflower that's in that picture, we don't have it anymore. It does grow in the magnesian limestone near Leeds in one place. I think there's about 3 plants surviving, but it did actually occur up at North Stainley, you know, at one time. So those are the most northerly sites in Britain that plant has ever grown. One odd exception to this is the plant on the right is an orchid called dark red helleborine, which I don't know whether it still occurs in our area, but it certainly did historically. And that's a northern plant that's at its southern limit here. So there's also several rare mosses that occur either exclusively or mainly on the magnesian limestone, although they tend to be species that are found on bare exposed rock rather than in the actual grassland. And we've actually got 1 or 2 of those at Nosterfield Quarry. There are a number of rare plants that are found on the magnesian limestone. So rare spring sedge there, that's one from one of the local sites where it grows, and thistle broomrape, which we've actually got at Kiln Lake at Nosterfield Quarry, and it also grows at several other sites. There's one of the best places to see it in the country is Quarry Moor Local Nature Reserve at Ripon. It grows at High Bats, it grows at Belfast on the other side of the river, it grows at Ewer Bank in Ripon and several other places. There are 2 very small populations on the Yorkshire Wolds and the chalk, but otherwise it's confined to the magnesian limestone in Yorkshire. It doesn't occur anywhere in Britain outside Yorkshire. We don't really know why, but it is, you know, one of the special plants of the magnesian limestone. A number of invertebrates. I don't think there are any invertebrates that are special, that occur uniquely on the magnesian limestone, but there are a number of insects that are characteristic of limestone grassland. So things like the dingy skipper butterfly, for instance. There's one of Charlie's moths that occurs on Ploughman spikenard at Nosterfield Nature Reserve. That's Ploughman spikenard is one of the limestone plants. Glowworms, which we don't have anymore, but used to be very common apparently around the old lime kilns and so on around Nosterfield. And this little critter here called the rock rose pollen beetle, and rock rose is one of the very characteristic plants of limestone grassland. So how rare is this habitat? Well, we don't know, and this is one of the reasons we sort of put this webinar together. Is we know this is a very rare habitat. We know it's one of North Yorkshire's rarest habitats. We know that it's really threatened, but we know very little about how much there actually is. Now, Natural England have come up with various figures. So they say there's just over 300 hectares on the Durham magnesian limestone, and there's been an awful lot of work done in County Durham. So that may be a reasonably accurate figure, but they're saying 900 hectares of the magnesian limestone grassland south of the Tees, and nobody I've spoken to thinks that's a credible figure. Everyone thinks the figure is much lower, but we don't know how much lower. So I don't really know the sites that are in Doncaster district, Barnsley district, Rotherham district. They've all got like little bits, and also, you know, it extends into Nottinghamshire. So I don't know those sites, and I don't know, you know, how big those areas are. But talking to a few people, they say, well, we've got hardly any. So it's a much rarer habitat than Natural England is suggesting. And it's rather peculiar they've come up with this figure, but when I've looked at it, they have these habitat inventories that are actually available online. And when I've looked into some of the sites, they do funny things like, so there's a site at Farnham, and they include the entire site is down as magnesian limestone grassland, although it's actually mostly a wetland site. But because of the way they classify sites of special scientific interest, and because of their administrative system, they've got it all down as magnesian limestone grassland. And they've got other sites that appear to have been surveyed maybe 40 years ago. We've no idea whether they still exist or what the habitat is now. So this may be why the figures are really not very credible. As one example of this, a detailed sort of like audit was done of Selby district. So I don't know whether you know the geography of North Yorkshire. Selby district actually goes like a long way down the A1. So it sort of like touches onto parts of West Yorkshire, and it includes quite a lot of the magnesian limestone. But when somebody looked in detail at their the habitats they've got in the district, the area of magnesian limestone grassland was actually 1/12 of the figure that had been suggested formally. So that's a big difference, isn't it? Over an order of magnitude difference. And if we're trying to conserve these habitats, we need to start with knowing roughly how much we've got. The information's never going to be perfect, but that kind of like disparity is obviously not very helpful. So magnesian limestone grassland is made up of a variety of habitats. You get the ancient kind of like pasture, like that bit at I showed you the picture from Ripon Parks, but there are also other habitats like disused quarries, disused railway lines, road verges, and so on. They tend not to be such good examples, but they are part of the wider habitat. So why is it so rare? Well, the simple fact is magnesian limestone is like really, it produces really good soils for arable cultivation. And if you think of the sort of like the lie of the land, say between Ripon and Massam or going up that ridge there, it's not like the chalk. Quite a lot of chalk grassland has survived on the Yorkshire wolds simply because the valley slopes are so steep, you can't plough them, so that grassland has survived. On the magnesian limestone, the land is very gently rolling. There's hardly anywhere that you couldn't plough if you were determined to do so. And it's also warm, easily cultivated soils that just make for really good arable cultivation. And you can see the way that the ridge has been occupied since Neolithic times or earlier. So it's always been somewhere that has been an attractive place to farm. I'm just going to try and move this out of the way a second. So if you look at these figures here, you can see this is for the entire southern. They divide the country into what they call national character areas, NCAs, just to explain that. So out the whole area, so this isn't farmland, it's the entire area. Half of it is grade 2 agricultural land. So grade 1, the very, very best agricultural land, is quite rare anyway, all over the country. So grade 2 is like really good, valuable, versatile arable land. So half of the whole of the magnesian limestone national character area is grade 2 farmland, and then another large wodge of it, 37%, is grade 3, which is also relatively good arable land. So this is why there isn't very much of it left, because it's easy to cultivate and makes good profitable farmland. Now it's likely, if you were to wind the clock back 250 years, you would have found there were large commons covered, big areas of the North Yorkshire lowlands. So things like Thornton Watlers Common, Nosterfield Common, Thornborough Moor, Ripon itself had several very big commons, and I think some of North Common would have been, on these areas there would have been large tracts, probably hundreds of acres of magnesian limestone grassland. However, after the enclosures, which is when these commons were broken up and divided into privately farmed fields, a lot of the grassland probably disappeared quite rapidly. And so by the start of the 20th century, magnesian limestone grassland was already quite rare. If you look at the map there in yellow, this was it won't be perfect, but it's a study a chap called Smith published in 1903, where he tried to map the main vegetation types in North Yorkshire. And so that's just a view of the Ewer Valley there, and the orange arrows are pointing to what he's mapped as natural or semi-natural grassland. And you can see, even by 120 years ago, that habitat was confined to quite small fragments. So again, you know, there's bits at Ripon Parks, there's bits along the river corridor and so on, but they're already quite small fragments by then. So the remaining magnesian limestone grassland is confined to a few places where valley slopes are too steep to cultivate. So the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust has an important reserve at Brockerdale. There are places a few places on ancient monuments. So the photo here is of the rock rose on the Thornborough Middlehenge. So again, although that is gravel, it's got a magnesian limestone flora. And then there are a handful of small sites that are survived by historic accidents. So Round Hill at Ripon Parks, for example, you know, it's just by historic fluke, it didn't get ploughed up, and then it became part of the army training area, and it survived as a result. And then we've got bits on road verges. So if anyone knows Farnham Lane at Farnham, there's a really lovely example of magnesian limestone grassland on the roadside bank there. So what are the threats to this habitat now? So we can see that it is now a very rare habitat. Some bits are still at risk of more intensive agricultural management. So there's actually one local wildlife site designated for its limestone grassland near Nosterfield, where part of it's actually been incorporated into an arable field. A lot of the sites that are left are small remnants that aren't easy to farm. So most of this grassland would have been grazed at one time or another, but what you've got now is you know, the steep banks surrounded by arable fields, or they're no longer accessible to livestock, or they're just too small to be worth fencing and grazing, or you know, in many cases the farmers just have arable land and they don't actually have any livestock anymore. So what tends to happen is these little bits, and they're often, I've looked at a lot, and they can be really good habitat, but they're often like half an acre at the most, and they're becoming covered in scrub, and unless there's some active management, they will just disappear and turn into woodland, which obviously will have its own interest in time, but you will lose the grassland flora and the butterflies and the other insects and so on. So under management is actually a problem on road verges too. So if you see this picture here, it's quite an Tadcaster. So again, a really, really nice bit, quite small, but a lovely bit of magnesian limestone grassland by the road there. That's just it's actually a flyover that goes over the A64, and what's happening, people get very upset about over management of road verges and road verges being cut while the flowers are still out and so on, which is understandable. But you have to remember, if you don't manage road verges at all, they turn quite quickly into brambles and hawthorn scrub, and that's exactly what's happening here, because NYCC has a policy, partly because they get a lot of flack about cutting verges. So what they tend to go to the opposite extreme, and with like minor rural verges, they don't cut them at all. So then this is what happens. Other problems include nutrient pollution. So I've said how the plants that grow on the magnesian limestone have adapted to an environment where it's quite difficult to get hold of plant nutrients. Well, there's various forms of pollution, particularly air pollution, that mean that all the kind of like the habitats that we have in the lowlands get a lot more nitrogen from air pollution than would normally be the case. And what that tends to do is it boosts big, fast-growing grasses. So again, on this particular road verge, there's some quite invasive grasses starting to take over, probably because they've got this extra nutrient that's being provided by atmospheric pollution. And then because we've got so little of this habitat, the populations of plants and invertebrates could easily die out. And because the patches are so small and they're so few and far between, it's actually quite unlikely that species will be able to recolonize those. So plants and insects dying out in one location is to some extent a natural process. It does happen, it's part of nature. The problem is when they've got no means of finding their way back. So that is a real problem with these sites. The one big place where we've got potential to recreate magnesian limestone grassland is on former quarries. Obviously, magnesian limestone is important. It's quarried for aggregates. It's quarried, especially further south. It's quarried for construction stone. So York Minster built from magnesian limestone. I think the Houses of Parliament are built from magnesian limestone because it has that lovely warmish reddy yellow texture to it that is good for architectural features. If you go into Selby district, like almost all the parish churches on and around the limestone belt are built from magnesian limestone and so on. So there's always been a lot of quarrying on the limestone ridge, but what tends to happen is quarries are much in demand for landfill, which generates a lot of profit for the quarry operators. So once they've finished, it'll be used just to often just inert waste. Vast quantities of kind of like basically subsoil from construction sites need to be put somewhere. So old quarries are a favourite site for that, and then they're often just topsoiled over and grassed over. Increasingly, you are getting quarry companies saying, well, we will restore this to limestone grassland, but they tend to have their approach to that, because they like to think they're leaving things neat and tidy. What they tend to do is put the material, the soil that they've quarried, they will store that and then put that back, and they will sow a commercial seed mixture on. And even if you call that a limestone grassland seed mixture, it often includes a completely inappropriate kind of like mixture of species. It often includes agricultural versions of native plants because the seed is a lot cheaper. Or even with the very best seed mixes, the seed has often come from the South Downs or the chalk in Dorset and so on. So the plants are genetically very different to what we've got in the local area. So unfortunately, although on paper quite a lot of magnesian limestone grassland will be recreated, it's probably far from ideal the way it's being done. So what we're asking people to do is just a very informal survey, and we know that there are various small bits of limestone grassland scattered around on road verges, churchyards, green lanes, bridleways, those kind of places, but we don't know where they all are. We can get information on what's left on the few sites of special scientific interest like Ripon Parks or Burton Leonard lime kilns, but there are the other bits that we don't know about. So we're just asking people to be aware of this habitat, and if you see it on your travels, if you see it on your local walks or cycle rides, just let us know. We're not asking anybody to fill out a complicated survey form. We just really need to know a location. A sketch map would be brilliant if you can provide it, and then just a note of the plants that you've seen there. And if you look on the website, there's a link there which will take you to like just a little bit more information about the survey. So there's a list of plants that are characteristic of the limestone, and there are some illustrations of those. There's a bit more information there. I think if you go on to if you can't find that link or haven't got a pen to write it down, I think if you go on to the LUCT website, and it's on, well, Emma will tell us in a minute where to find it on the website. So there's a bit more information there, and if you just a quick email to Emma, and then we can follow that up. So basically, the area that we're interested in more or less goes from say the A59 roundabout on the A1 there at Flaxby through to Knaresborough, and then if you take an oblong roughly up to sort of like Catterick in the east and Colburn in the west, that pretty much takes in the magnesian limestone belt. But if you come across sites that are a bit outside that area, by all means let us know. We'll still be interested, and hopefully we can use this information, if not now, at some time in future, to try and look at how we might possibly be able to link up some of these fragments that are left. If nothing else, it provides us with a list of places we could potentially harvest seed from for habitat recreation. I think you're probably all aware that we're doing some work on the magnesian limestone outcrop at Kiln at Nosterfield Quarry. And we've established that if we can keep the bunnies out, we could potentially establish really nice grassland on there. It's worth pointing out, of course, that the grassland you could create on quarried sites is never going to be the same as ancient pasture like you've got at Ripon Parks, and there's no pretense to do that. But actually, quite a wide variety of those characteristic limestone plants could potentially grow on those sites, but we want to know where the local seed sources are. So any information you can give us would be really useful for conserving this habitat in the future. So thank you, and I'll hand back to Emma.
Thanks, Martin. Was there going to be a slide with some of the plants?
Oh, there probably was, wasn't there? Just said that, yes, yeah. So this is just some illustrations of some of the plants. There's lots of others. There's a long list of limestone plants on the website, and these photos are on the website too. But there's plenty of I'm sure most of you have got identification guides and so on. So what we're saying is, if you look at the list of plants, if there's 2 or more of them in an area, we'll be interested. If there's just like a patch of oxeye daisies or whatever on a road verge, it's probably not that significant. But if you say you've got quite a lot of oxeye daisies, and you've got cowslips, and you've got field scabious, then that probably is of more interest. So that's the kind of thing we're looking out for.
All right, great. Thanks, Martin. Yeah, I'll put a link to the website on the WhatsApp groups, so that everybody can find it. But if you do just go onto the website under projects, it's under our, because this is a part of our new Yorkshire Water Biodiversity Fund project. So it's under that tab on the website as well. But like I say, I'll put a link up too. So yeah, if anybody, can you stop sharing your screen, Martin?
Yeah, so stop share. There we go.
So if anybody at this point has any questions, raise your hand, or see as there's not that many of us, you probably just shout out, but like you covered everything, Martin.
Stunned silence, yeah. So I've either covered everything or everyone's fallen asleep. So.
Flummoxed.
So this is, the idea of this survey is that it's very informal. It's really just, please be aware of this habitat. And if you're, out on your travels and you say, yeah, those are some limestone plants. Just let us know. If you can give us a reasonable location. You can always sort of like do something like, I often just take a snip from Google Earth or from an online map, and then scribble on it. You can often sort of, on the snip tool, there's a highlighter and things like that. That kind of thing. Just put a circle around it or whatever. Very simple, and then we can follow that up. As and when.
Are you aware of all the oxeye daisies on the relief road near Bedale and Martin or not?
On the new bypass?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know where the motel is? That bit, what used to be Old A1 that now isn't, but it's what they call Service Road.
Oh, right, the local service, yes. Yeah, it's a bit complicated there because that would have been, I know that was Sowen.
Oh, right.
When they when they did not the latest A1 works, but the improvements before that was all I think there's sort of like soda wildflower mixture along there. But yeah, that is a good point. There are verges along there with other species on.
Yeah.
I think there's been quite a lot of sowing on the ring road around Ripon, and on the ring road to Harrogate there's quite a lot of cowslip and primrose.
Yeah, I think that There definitely has on the and the A59 bit when it skirts around Knaresborough and so on. That is yeah. I mean, if it's obviously so, and it's of less interest, but if it looks like more natural grass, and I was thinking, more along sort of minor roads and green lanes and bridle ways and that kind of like thing. That we know there are bits, but we certainly don't know where all of them are.
All right.
Right. Well,
I think that's it then.
simple.
Yeah. All
Can I
right.
just
Thank
ask you
you.
a quick question? Is it marked on the map on the website, the bits that you do know about, just in case you were out and you got really excited that you'd found some, but actually everybody knows about it anyway?
No, to tell us anyway, because the problem is that there isn't Natural England come up with these figures, but there isn't really a sort of like a written inventory. There isn't a kind of like a spreadsheet anywhere that says, this is where the remaining magnesian limestone grassland is. I mean, that's what we're trying to get to for our little sort of patch of the world, as it were. So don't worry about that. Just tell us anyway.
Okay.
I mean, there are like I say, there's 2 or 3 sites of special scientific interest, Ripon Parks and Burton Leonard lime kilns being the obvious ones. But anything else, tell us anyway, please.
Mm-hmm.
And we may, I think, once, unfortunately, I'm kind of like out of action at the moment with a broken leg, but now is the ideal sort of like time to go and look. Had I been a bit more mobile, I would try sort of like organising a couple of visits to some of these special sites, but that may be something that we could do next year if people are interested. Go and see some of the top quality examples of this type of habitat.
Yeah, that would be really nice, I think.
Yep. Okay, well.
Yeah, if that's it, then we'll end there.
All right.
So yeah, thanks everybody for joining us, and
Thank
keep
you.
your eyes peeled.
Well, no.
Okay, bye then.